The notice tacked to the post outside the general store in Callow Creek read, "Wanted. Ranch hand, male, strong back, no complaints," and Matilda Bancroft read it twice, folded her worn leather gloves into her coat pocket, and walked straight through Frederick Collier's front gate anyway. The year was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was still a raw, unpredictable stretch of earth, where the wind came off the Laramie Mountains like a cold blade, and the sky went on forever in every direction, indifferent to the ambitions of any soul foolish enough to try and tame it. Callow Creek was a small town, the kind that existed more out of stubbornness than prosperity, with a single main street, a church that doubled as a courtroom when the circuit judge passed through, a saloon that never seemed to close, and a blacksmith who also pulled teeth when necessary. The people who lived there were tough and practical, and they did not spend much time on sentiment. Matilda Bancroft was 26 years old, and she had the kind of face that men noticed and then quickly decided was trouble, not because she was unpleasant to look at, but because her eyes were the color of good creek water, clear and a little cold, and they had a way of looking straight through whatever a person was saying to whatever they actually meant. She had come west 3 years earlier from Ohio with her father, Daniel Bancroft, who had purchased 40 acres east of Callow Creek, with intentions of raising cattle and living free of the eastern city noise he had always despised. Daniel had died 14 months ago, in the February of 1877, from a lung sickness that the doctor in Laramie City said had likely been building for years. He had left Matilda the 40 acres, a 2-room cabin, 1 horse named Pepper, $17.40 in a tin box under the floorboard, and absolutely no guidance on how a woman alone was supposed to keep a homestead alive through a Wyoming winter. She had managed anyway. She had traded labor with the Hendersons 2 miles east, helped their wife with canning and their eldest boy with fence mending in exchange for enough beef to see her through the cold months. She had repaired the cabin roof herself with timber she felled and dragged. She had shot a deer in October and cured the meat herself, following the instructions in her father's old notebook the way another woman might follow a recipe for cake. She had done all of this, and she had survived, but surviving was not the same as living, and by the spring of 1878 it was clear to Matilda that she needed income. Real income, the kind that came in regularly and could be counted on, not the irregular patchwork of trade and barter that had gotten her through one winter but would not sustain her indefinitely. She had skills that most women in Callow Creek did not have. Her father had raised her the way he would have raised a son, partly because he had wanted a son and partly because he had been a practical man who saw no reason to teach a child only half of what the world required. Matilda could ride as well as any cowhand. She could rope a calf, read the weather by the color of the clouds, mend a fence, shoe a horse in a pinch, and identify the signs of illness in cattle before the illness became a crisis. She was not as strong as a large man, she knew that, but she was observant and she was tireless, and she genuinely understood livestock in a way that went beyond technique into something closer to instinct. Frederick Collier's ranch was the largest operation within 15 miles of Callow Creek. He ran close to 800 head of longhorn cattle on 3,000 acres of deeded land, with 2 additional sections of open range he used by custom, if not by title. He had come to Wyoming from Texas 8 years earlier, in 1870, when he was 28, and he had built the Collier Ranch from one small herd and a lot of borrowed money into something that the Cattlemen's Association in Cheyenne had begun to take seriously. He was 36 now, and he had the kind of weathered, particular handsomeness that came from spending most of your life outdoors making difficult decisions. His hair was dark brown with the first suggestions of gray at the temples. His hands were large and permanently calloused. He was not a man who laughed easily, but when he did laugh, the sound of it surprised people because it was genuine and warm, not the polite noise most men in his position made when they thought it was expected of them. He had posted the notice for a ranch hand because his crew was 2 men short. One of his hands, a young man named Carey, had broken his leg badly in a riding accident in March and would not be useful for months. Another hand, an older man named Walt, had simply left one morning in April without explanation, taking his bedroll and his mule and nothing that belonged to Frederick. Frederick suspected Walt had a better offer somewhere, and he did not begrudge the man for taking it, but the timing was poor. Spring was calving season, and calving season on a ranch of 800 head was not something a man could manage short-handed without consequences. He had written the notice himself, sitting at the table in the ranch house kitchen by lamplight, and he had written mail without giving it particular thought. It was simply what he expected. It was what everyone expected. The ranching work of the Wyoming Territory in 1878 was men's work by custom and by assumption, and Frederick Collier was not a man who spent much time questioning custom. He tacked the notice to the post outside the general store on a Tuesday morning and expected to spend the rest of the week interviewing the men who would come to his gate. Matilda Bancroft appeared on Wednesday afternoon. Frederick was working in the near corral when he saw her come through the gate on a bay mare that was not as good a horse as his but was well cared for and moved properly. She rode well. He noticed that immediately before he noticed anything else. She sat straight but relaxed, her weight balanced correctly, her hands quiet on the reins. She wore a practical split riding skirt in brown canvas, a cream-colored shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat against the sun. When she stopped at the corral fence and looked down at him, her eyes were calm and direct, and she said, "I am here about the ranch hand position, Mr. Collier. My name is Matilda Bancroft." Frederick straightened up from the fence post he had been examining and looked at her for a moment. He thought about the word male on the notice. He thought about the custom and the assumption. He said, "I posted the position for a man, Miss Bancroft." "I read that," she said. "I also read that you need someone who knows cattle and can work hard and show up every day. I know cattle and I can work hard and I will show up every day. I thought those things mattered more than the other." He should have sent her away. He knew that even as he was standing there looking at her with the afternoon sun falling across the corral in long yellow bars, he should have said thank you for coming. No, he should have said it wasn't suitable. He should have said any of the dozen things a reasonable ranch owner in the Wyoming Territory said to a woman who showed up to apply for a man's job. Instead he said, "Get down off the horse and come show me how you mend a fence." It was a test, and Matilda understood it as such. She dismounted efficiently, tied the mare to the post, walked to the pile of cedar rails and wire near the far side of the corral, and proceeded to demonstrate that she knew exactly what she was doing. She worked without asking for instruction. She found the weak spots, she set the rails correctly, she stretched the wire with the right tool from the right angle and did not waste motion. It took her 14 minutes to repair a section of fence that Frederick's last hand would have taken 25 minutes on, and gotten wrong besides. Frederick watched the whole time without saying anything. When she finished and turned to face him, she had a smear of dust on her jaw and her hands were dirty, and her eyes had that same clear, direct quality they had had from the horse. "What are you asking for wages?" he said. "Same as you'd pay a man," she said. He thought about that. The going rate for a ranch hand in Wyoming in 1878 was around $25 to $30 a month plus room and board. He had been planning to offer $25. "I'll pay you $25 a month," he said. "Room and board as discussed, which means the bunkhouse. You'll have to make an arrangement with Dovey, she's my cook and housekeeper, about the sleeping situation. I've got 2 other hands, Reuben and Silas. They're good men. I'll tell them how it is and I'll expect no trouble about it." Matilda nodded. "I have a homestead I need to maintain," she said. "My own place 40 acres east of town. I'll need 1 full day each week to see to it." Frederick considered. 1 day a week was not unreasonable. "Sundays," he said. "You'll have Sundays." "Agreed," she said. They shook hands across the corral fence, and Frederick Collier told himself it was purely a practical arrangement, and he almost believed it. Dovie Mitchell was a black woman of about 50 who had come to work for Frederick 4 years earlier after her husband died, and she needed employment. She had cooked and kept house for the Collier ranch with a combination of efficiency and quiet authority that meant Frederick deferred to her opinions on domestic matters the same way he deferred to his foreman Reuben on cattle matters. When Frederick explained the situation that evening, Dovie listened without interruption, then said, "She can share the cookroom. It's separate from the bunkhouse, and I've got a second cot that isn't being used." She paused. "Is she capable?" "Yes," Frederick said. "Very." Dovie nodded, satisfied. "Then I don't see what the problem is." The problem, as it turned out, was Silas Prewitt. Silas was 32, a compact, dark-eyed man from Missouri who had been riding for Frederick for 2 years and who had a tendency to express displeasure through long, loaded silences and small acts of inconvenient unhelpfulness. When Frederick told his two hands about the new arrangement the following morning before breakfast, Reuben Tate, who was 45 and built like a barn door and had a disposition that matched his build in solidity if not in warmth, simply said "all right" and went back to his coffee. Silas said nothing, which was worse. Matilda arrived the next morning at first light, which was when Frederick had told her to come. She came ready to work, with her own tools in a canvas roll and her hat pulled down against the early chill. Frederick took her around the property that first morning, not as a courtesy but as a genuine orientation, because a ranch hand who didn't know the layout of a property was a ranch hand who would waste time on simple things. He showed her the home pastures and the back range, the creek crossings, the location of the calving barn, the condition of the herd, and the particular temperament of several individual animals she'd need to know about, including a large bull named Commodore who had strong opinions about strangers in his field. She asked good questions. Not too many, not performative, but the questions a person asked when they were actually paying attention and thinking ahead. When he showed her the calving barn, she noted immediately that 2 of the cows nearest the rail were showing signs that would put them close to delivering within 24 hours, and she was right about both of them. By the end of the first week, Frederick knew he had not made a mistake in hiring her. By the end of the second week, Reuben had reached the same conclusion and expressed it in the only way he expressed approval of anything, which was by including her without comment in the natural organization of work, handing her one end of whatever needed 2 people, and grunting what passed for conversation. By the end of the third week, even Silas had been forced by the plain evidence of her competence to abandon his silence campaign, though he replaced it with a posture of deliberate indifference that was marginally better. The calving season that spring was a difficult one. A late cold snap in early May brought 3 nights of temperatures that killed 2 calves who were too young and too small to survive the frost without intervention. Matilda sat up through all 3 of those nights in the calving barn with a lantern, and whatever calf was most at risk, keeping them warm with her body heat and the thin blankets from the supply barn, and occasionally giving them warm water from a bottle when they were too weak to nurse. Frederick found her there each morning when he came to check, dark circles under her eyes and hay in her hair, calm and matter-of-fact about what she was doing the same way she was calm and matter-of-fact about everything. The third morning he sat down in the barn straw beside her and the calf she was keeping warm, a small roan that had been born premature and had been fighting for its life for 4 days. "You don't have to do this," he said. "The losses are part of it, you know that." "I know," she said, "but this one hasn't decided to die yet, and I'd rather not make the decision for him." Frederick watched her for a moment in the lantern light. She had her coat wrapped around the calf and her back against the barn wall, and she was perfectly still, not performing anything, not trying to be seen doing something good. She was just doing the thing because it needed doing. "The roan," he said. "Give him a name." "It'll make it worse later maybe, but it'll also make it better now." Matilda looked at him sideways. You name your cattle, only the ones worth naming, he said. She thought about it. Perseverance, she said, Percy for short. That's a terrible name for a cow. He's a calf, not a cow, and he's going to live so the name will have time to grow on you. Percy did live. He grew into a solid, healthy animal who would cause Frederick minor grief for the next several years by always finding the weak spot in whatever fence was containing him. And Frederick would always secretly believe that the stubbornness was something he had absorbed from the woman who sat with him through his first cold nights in the world. What Matilda didn't say that morning in the barn, and what Frederick didn't say either, was that the quality of the silence between them had changed somewhere in those long, cold nights. It was not uncomfortable. It was something quite different from uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who did not need to fill the air between them with unnecessary words, because the air between them was already full of something they were both, in their separate ways, too cautious to name. Matilda had not come west looking for a man. She had come west because her father came west, and she had stayed because the land had gotten into her in the way land gets into certain people, permanently and without asking permission. She had watched other women in Callow Creek conduct their lives within very small rooms, literally and figuratively, and she had never wanted that. She had not thought of herself as someone who was against love or against a husband, but she had recognized instinctively that the love she could accept would have to be the kind that made her larger rather than smaller, and in her experience that was not a common kind. Frederick Collier, in the first weeks of knowing her, did nothing that made her feel smaller. He corrected her when she was wrong about something, without apology and without softening, the same way he corrected Reuben and Silas when they were wrong. He deferred to her judgment when she was clearly right, without visible struggle. He did not explain things to her that she had not asked to have explained. He did not watch her the way some men watched women who were doing things men expected to do themselves, with that particular quality of waiting for the failure they had already decided was inevitable. He simply worked alongside her, and the work was the measure of everything. She noticed, though. She noticed him the way she noticed everything, with that clear, observant attention she brought to the world. She noticed that he was the first one up every morning and the last one to stop working every evening, not out of performance, but out of genuine investment in the thing he had built. She noticed that he was patient with animals in a way that some people are patient with nothing else on earth. She noticed that when he laughed it was at something actually funny, and when he was troubled, he went quiet in a way that was different from Silas's loaded silence, deeper and more private. She noticed that he had books on the shelf in his office, not for display but for reading, their spines broken open and pages marked with whatever scraps of paper came to hand. She did not at first think of any of this as falling in love. She thought of it as getting to know a person, which was different. But the line between those two things is not as clear as people like to pretend. June came, and with it the real work of the summer. The cattle had to be moved to higher range pastures before the heat dried the lower grasslands. That meant a drive of 40 miles north to the mountain meadows Frederick leased each summer from a ranching cooperative he belonged to. The drive would take 3 days, and it would take all hands. Frederick told Matilda about it the second week of June, matter-of-factly, expecting no issue. She nodded and asked what she should bring. He told her. She asked nothing else. The drive north was the first time they spent extended time working in close proximity, and it changed things between them in ways neither of them could have precisely articulated at the time. The cattle drive was grueling, dusty, loud work, keeping 800 animals moving together along a route that included 3 creek crossings and a rocky stretch that the cattle hated and expressed their hatred of by trying to scatter in 7 directions at once. Reuben and Silas handled the flanks. Frederick and Matilda rode swing and drag in rotation. And by the second day, everyone was bone-tired and covered in trail dust and speaking in the clipped, functional language of people who are conserving energy. The nights on the trail were different from the days. The cattle settled. The fire was small against the enormous Wyoming sky, and the air up north had a quality of stillness that was unlike anything on the flat open plains below. Matilda sat by the fire that second night cleaning her rifle, and Frederick was nearby repairing a broken cinch buckle by firelight, and Reuben and Silas were both asleep already, and the silence was the kind that asks questions. "You read much?" Frederick said, not looking up from the buckle. She glanced at him. "Some. My father had books." "What sort?" "History, some poetry. He liked Sir Walter Scott, though I always thought Scott went on too long." Frederick looked up at that. The corner of his mouth moved. "My mother had the complete works of Sir Walter Scott," he said. "I've read most of them. You're right that he goes on too long." "What do you read?" she asked. "Whatever comes through," he said. "I ordered a copy of Moby Dick 3 years ago from a bookseller in Cheyenne. Took 6 months to arrive. I've read it 4 times. Matilda considered this. "That seems like a lot of times for a book about a whale." "It's not really about the whale," he said. "I know," she said. "I've read it too." He looked at her then, a full, considering look, and she looked back at him with the same directness she always had, and the firelight moved between them, and Reuben made a sound in his sleep that broke the moment, and they both looked away at the same time. The cattle settled into the mountain meadows on the 3rd afternoon, and Frederick's crew set up the summer grazing camp with the efficiency of people who had done this before. And then Frederick and Matilda and Silas rode the 40 miles back to the home ranch while Reuben stayed at the summer camp, which was the usual arrangement. On the ride home, Silas developed a headache, or at least said he had one, and pushed ahead, leaving Frederick and Matilda riding together at a comfortable distance behind him. The country through which they rode was beautiful in the late afternoon, the kind of Wyoming landscape that could make a person feel small and grateful at the same time, the mountains high and blue behind them and the plains rolling away south in waves of gold-green grass. "Do you like it here?" Frederick said, after they had ridden in silence for some time. It was a different kind of question from the usual ranch talk, and they both knew it. "Yes," Matilda said, without hesitation. "I like it very much. I always did, even the winter, which everyone seems to think should be a complaint but isn't. You spent a winter alone on your homestead." "I did. That must have been hard." "It was hard and it was good," she said, "both at the same time, the way most things worth doing are." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your father taught you most of what you know," you said. "Most of it. He was a good teacher, not a soft one, but a good one." "Do you miss him?" The question was direct, and she treated it that way. "Every day," she said. "Not desperately anymore the way it was at first, more like an awareness, like a room in a house where someone used to be." Frederick nodded slowly. He understood that kind of missing. His own father had died in Texas in 1872, and he had not been there, and that absence at the moment of death had added something to the grief that simple death alone would not have. He did not say any of this, but something about the way he nodded told her he understood from experience, not from imagination. They rode in silence for another mile, and then Matilda said, "You've never asked me why I came about the position when you'd posted it for a man." "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to," he said. She thought about that. "I needed the work," she said, "but it was more than just needing the work. I needed to do work that matched what I'm actually capable of. Anything less was going to feel like a slow disappearing." He looked at her then, and she could see that he understood that too, understood it bone deep the way you only understand something you've also lived. He said, "I almost sent you away." "I know," she said. "I'm glad I didn't," he said, plain and direct the way he said most things. She looked ahead at the trail and said, "So am I," and the simplicity of it sat between them like a stone in a stream, solid and real and worn smooth by water. Back at the ranch, summer settled in fully, and the work shifted from the intensity of calving and the drive to the long, steady labor of maintenance and monitoring, checking on the summer herd, keeping the fences sound, handling the smaller herd that Frederick kept on the home range year-round for local sale. The rhythm of it was comfortable, and the days had a shape to them that Matilda had not had since her father was alive. Sundays she spent on her own homestead. She had not given it up, would not give it up, both because it was all she had from her father, and because she understood instinctively that keeping it was a way of keeping herself whole. On those Sundays she rode out to the 40 acres and maintained what she'd built, patched what needed patching, and sometimes sat on the porch her father had built in the last good year of his health and let herself simply be still for an hour. One Sunday in late July, she arrived at the homestead to find a letter on her doorstep, slipped under the door. She did not receive many letters, and this one was from a lawyer in Columbus, Ohio, who wrote to inform her that a distant relative of her father's, a man she had never met, was disputing the title to the 40 acres on the grounds that Daniel Bancroft had purchased the land from a seller who may not have had clear title himself, and that her ownership might be subject to challenge. Matilda read the letter twice, and then she sat down on the porch step and looked out at her father's land for a long time. The letter frightened her in a way that most things did not frighten her, because the land was the one thing she could not replace. She could find other work. She could not find another connection to her father, to the thing they had come out here to build together, to the 2 seasons she had spent keeping it alive on her own. She did not tell Frederick right away. She spent a week thinking it through on her own, as was her way, trying to understand what it would take to defend the title, and whether she could do it, and what it would cost. The answer to whether she could do it on her own was probably not, and the answer to what it would cost was more than she had. It was Dovey who noticed something was wrong. Dovey noticed most things, quietly and without announcement. One evening after supper she sat down next to Matilda at the kitchen table and said, "Something's troubling you," not as a question. Matilda looked at her and then showed her the letter. Dovey read it carefully. She had taught herself to read after the war, with the thoroughness and deliberateness of someone who understood that literacy was a form of power that had been deliberately kept from her, and she read the lawyer's letter with the same careful attention she brought to the Bible verses she studied on Sunday evenings. "You need to tell Frederick," she said when she was done. "It's my business," Matilda said. "It is," Dovey agreed. "And he knows a lawyer in Laramie City who handled the title to his South section 3 years ago. That's a fact that might be useful to you." Matilda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You think I should ask him for help?" "I think you should use the resources you have," Dovey said. "Using the resources you have isn't the same as being helpless. I've had to learn that lesson too." Matilda thought about Dovey, who had survived things that Matilda's troubles did not come close to, and who had built a life in this place with the tools she had and the determination that no one could take from her. "Yes," she said. "All right." She told Frederick the next morning before the day's work started, catching him while he was saddling his horse in the barn. She showed him the letter and explained the situation with the same directness with which she did everything. She did not ask for help directly. She laid out the facts and waited. Frederick read the letter. His face was still while he read it, but something moved in his jaw, a tension, a tightening, the kind a man gets when something angers him and he is controlling it. When he finished, he said, "Who is this relative? I've never met him. My father and his father were estranged before I was born. And your father's title?" "He purchased the land through the Callow Creek Land Office in 1875. I have the deed. I've always had it." "That should be sufficient," Frederick said, "but you'll want a lawyer to say so formally and put it in a way that makes the challenge expensive enough to abandon." He folded the letter and handed it back to her. "I'll write to James Aldrich in Laramie City today. He handled a title dispute for me in 1875, and he's sharp and he doesn't overcharge. He'll know what to do." "I can't afford," she began. "Matilda," he said, and then stopped and started again. "We'll sort out the money part. Write to the lawyer first." It was the first time he had used her first name. She noticed it the same way she noticed everything. She did not say anything about it, and neither did he, but it sat in the air between them in the barn with the smell of horses and hay and the morning light coming through the slats. Frederick wrote to James Aldrich in Laramie City that same day. Aldrich replied within a week, and the letter that came back was encouraging. The title dispute appeared to rest on thin legal grounds, and with the original deed and the land office records from Callow Creek, the challenge could almost certainly be defeated without significant difficulty. The distant relative in Ohio would need to find much stronger grounds, or more likely, would find that the cost of pursuing a legal action across several states was greater than whatever he expected to gain. The resolution of the title matter took most of the rest of the summer, with letters going back and forth, and Matilda bearing the cost of Aldrich's fees with the money she had saved from her wages at the Collier ranch, which she had been careful not to spend on anything that was not essential. By September, Aldrich had filed the necessary papers, and the challenge collapsed precisely as he had predicted. The 40 acres remained Matilda's, clear and uncontested. On the evening the final letter arrived confirming it, Matilda sat at the kitchen table and felt the tension she had been carrying for 2 months leave her body all at once, leaving something lighter and quieter in its place. Dovey made coffee and put a small piece of cake left from Sunday on the table beside her cup and said, "Your father would be pleased," and Matilda believed this was true. When Frederick came in from the evening check on the stock, she told him the news. His face did something she had not quite seen it do before, a genuine, unguarded relief, as if the outcome had mattered to him personally in a way he had not been planning to reveal. He said, "Good. That's very good," and then he stood there in the kitchen looking at her for a moment too long, and they were both aware of it, and then he said, "Dovey, is there any of that cake left?" And Dovey said, "For you." "No," and the moment eased into something ordinary. But Matilda lay awake that night in the cook room thinking about the look on his face, and she thought about the 40 acres and the letter, and the fact that he had written to Aldrich without being asked to, and had not made her feel indebted for it, had simply done the thing and stepped back, the way a person does when they are acting out of care and not out of a desire for credit. The summer had changed her feelings, and she was no longer in any real doubt about what those feelings were, but she was cautious with them, the way a person is cautious with something fragile and important. She had not come here for this. She was not the kind of woman who came places for this. But she was also not the kind of woman who denied what was true when it was standing plainly in front of her. August gave way to September and September to the shorter, more serious days of October, when the air in the Wyoming territory started to carry the particular cold weight that meant the serious business of winter preparation could not be put off. The summer herd came down from the mountain pastures, and the work was in the fencing and the hay stores and the shelter buildings, making sure everything on the ranch was ready for what Wyoming winters could be. During the second week of October, they had a visitor. His name was Gerald Stanton, and he was a land agent who represented a cattle syndicate based in Cheyenne that was buying up range land throughout the territory. The syndicates had been moving through Wyoming since the mid-1870s, consolidating land and cattle under Eastern and even British money, and most of the smaller ranchers regarded them with a wariness that was well-founded. The syndicates had money enough to hire lawyers and political connections enough to make life difficult for individual operators who declined to sell. Stanton arrived on a Tuesday morning in a good coat and a clean hat, and with the particular manner of a man who is very confident that whatever he is selling is going to be sold. He asked to speak with Frederick privately, and Frederick brought him into the ranch house office and offered him coffee and listened to the pitch. The syndicate wanted to acquire the Collier ranch. They were offering good money, enough that a man could live comfortably on it for years, and they were presenting it as an opportunity rather than a threat, which was the standard approach. Frederick listened all the way through politely without interrupting, and then he said, "No, not for any price. Thank you for coming." Stanton adjusted the angle of his pitch as agents did. He suggested that holding out against the syndicates was not a long-term viable strategy, that they would control the best range within a few years anyway, and the small operators would find themselves squeezed out. He said this with the careful tone of someone who wants you to understand it as information rather than a threat. Frederick said, I've heard that argument before. The answer is still no. Have a safe ride back to Cheyenne. Stanton left, but as he went through the yard, he stopped and spoke to Silas, who was working near the bunkhouse. Matilda was nearby, unloading feed from the wagon, and she heard only pieces of the exchange. But she heard enough to know that Stanton was asking questions about the ranch that were more detailed than a man would ask after being told no. Questions about the water rights to the North Creek, about the summer lease arrangement, about how many head Frederick was currently running. After Stanton rode away, Matilda found Silas and said, "What was he asking you about?" Silas looked at her in that way he had, guarded and a little resentful. "Nothing," he said. "Silas," she said, with the particular quality of patience that was actually a form of pressure. "He was asking about the water rights." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He was just curious about the operation." "He was just told no by your employer," Matilda said. "Curious is something different from that." She told Frederick about it that evening, again factually and without drama. Frederick's expression went still in the way it went still when he was thinking about something serious. He thanked her and said nothing else. But the next morning he rode to Callow Creek and had a conversation with two men she did not know, and she understood without being told that he was beginning to put precautions in place. The syndicate made no immediate move, but the knowledge of their interest hung over the autumn like weather. Frederick worked with an added purposefulness those weeks, as if the threat had clarified something for him about what he was building and why. Silas left in November. He gave no particular reason, just that he had a chance to ride south for the winter and he was taking it. Frederick accepted the resignation without visible surprise, paid him what was owed, and shook his hand at the gate. After he was gone, Frederick said only that he had expected it eventually. Matilda did not ask what he meant by that. With Silas gone and Carrie still not fully recovered from his leg, the winter crew was thin, just Frederick, Reuben, and Matilda. Reuben was solid and experienced, but he was not a young man, and Frederick was careful about how much he asked of him in the coldest months. The result was that Matilda and Frederick worked together more directly, more constantly, than they had before, side by side in the compressed space of winter routine. The first big storm of the season came in the last week of November, 3 days of blowing snow that kept everyone close to the buildings and the animals. They spent those days moving between the barn and the bunkhouse and the house, keeping the stock warm and fed, digging out paths between buildings when the drifts closed them, and living in the particular intimacy of people confined by weather. On the second evening of the storm, after supper, Dovey went to bed early with a headache, and Reuben was asleep in the bunkhouse, and Frederick and Matilda were sitting by the kitchen stove with the snow driving against the windows and the light from the oil lamp making the room feel very small and very warm. Frederick had a book open on his knee. Matilda was mending a harness. The fire talked to itself, and outside the world was white and invisible. "Tell me something about your life before Wyoming," Frederick said, not looking up from his book. Matilda considered. "We lived in Columbus. My father worked for a railroad surveying company. We were comfortable, not wealthy. My mother died when I was 11. She paused. "What do you want to know?" "I don't know exactly," he said. "I suppose I realize I know a great deal about how you work and not much about how you got to be the way you are." She looked at him across the small distance of the kitchen. "And how am I?" He closed the book, keeping his place with his finger. He thought about it seriously, not rushing toward an answer that was really a flattery. "Uncommon," he finally said. "You're very uncommon." She felt the word land in her chest. It was not a word that asked anything of her or promised anything. It was simply a true thing, offered plainly, the way he offered most things. She said, "My father always told me that the world was large enough for a woman to be herself in it if she was willing to find the right part of it." "Smart man," Frederick said. "He was," she said. "Are you going to tell me something about yourself, or am I the only one being questioned?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair," he said. "My father was a cattle rancher in Texas. I grew up on a ranch smaller than this one." I came north in 1870 because I could see that Texas was going to be crowded with men all trying to do the same thing, and I wanted to be somewhere that was still open. He paused. I've never regretted it, even the winters. Even the winters, she repeated. Even the winters, he confirmed. They're honest. There's nothing a Wyoming winter pretends to be. The storm blew itself out by the morning of the third day, and the world emerged white and quiet and brilliant in the cold sun, and they went back to work with the ease of people who had found, during those close-kept days, that the closeness did not diminish either of them, but instead added something to both. December came, and with it, a particular evening that Matilda would remember for the rest of her life, with a combination of warmth and the faint embarrassment of having been almost too slow to understand what was happening. It was a Friday, and Dovey had gone to spend the weekend with a family 3 miles north who attended the same church, leaving the ranch house in the care of the people who lived in it. Reuben ate supper in the bunkhouse, as was his custom. Frederick and Matilda ate at the kitchen table, a simple supper of beef and potatoes, and afterward Frederick poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her, and then stood at the window looking out at the dark yard with his own cup in his hand. After a moment he said, without turning from the window, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. He turned then, and she saw that his face had that particular stillness she associated with serious things, but also something underneath the stillness that was not still at all. He said, "I've been trying to find the right way to say this for some time, and I've concluded that there probably isn't a particularly right way and I should simply say it." She was very still. "I'd like to court you," he said. "If that's something you'd consider. I want to say clearly that it has nothing to do with the job and it doesn't change the job, and if you'd rather I hadn't said anything at all I'll understand that and we'll go on as we have been." He paused. "But I'd like to say that I think you are the most remarkable person I've met in my adult life, and I would very much like the chance to know you as more than my ranch hand, if you'd allow it." Matilda sat with this for a moment. She thought about the clear Wyoming mornings and the calving barn and the campfire and the cattle drive and the look on his face when the letter about her land came good, and she thought about all the careful, deliberate things he did and didn't say, and she thought about the 17 months of evidence she had accumulated about who this man actually was. "I've been hoping you'd say something like that," she said, "for quite some time now." Something shifted in his face, the way ice shifts on a river when the temperature changes, a cracking open of something that had been carefully kept. He sat down across from her at the table and they looked at each other in the lamplight, and there was nothing careful or restrained about the moment. It was simply 2 people who had found each other in a very large country and finally stopped pretending it was anything other than what it was. "Well," he said, and there was that laugh, the real one, warm and genuine and surprising. "I should have said something 3 months ago." "You should have," she agreed. "I was beginning to think you were extremely unobservant." "I'm extremely cautious," he said. "There's a difference." "Not always," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his hand was warm and calloused and very certain, and she turned her hand over in his and held on, and the stove ticked, and the night pressed against the windows, and the world was very quiet and very good. The courting that followed was, by necessity, conducted somewhat practically, given that they lived and worked on the same ranch, and the demands of that work did not pause for romance. But within those practical structures, Frederick found ways to be deliberate about it. He began to save things to tell her, observations and small pieces of news and things he had read, bringing them out in the evenings by the stove. He took to riding home from town with her on those occasions when they went to Callow Creek together, finding a pace that was slower than necessary and a route that was a little longer than the most direct one. In January, he ordered 2 books through the Cheyenne bookseller and gave them to her without particular ceremony, just set them on the table beside her coffee one morning, and she understood what they were before she picked them up. She gave back what he gave, in kind if not always in identical form. She was not demonstrative in the way of some women, given to easy declarations and open sentiment, but she was attentive in ways that he noticed and valued. She remembered things he had said, brought them back in relevant moments. She took his side without being asked to when the syndicate's agent came back in January and made noise again, this time with a letter through the Callow Creek post office raising questions about the summer grazing lease. Matilda, who had listened carefully to everything about the ranch's legal and operational situation, pointed out to Frederick that the lease was registered with the territory's Livestock Commission and could not be challenged through the land office, and the agent's approach was therefore either ignorant or deliberately misleading. Frederick took this information to the Livestock Commission and the matter died promptly. "You know," he said to her afterward on the ride back from the commission office in Laramie City where they had gone together, "I can count on one hand the number of people whose judgment I trust completely." "How many hands?" she said. "I said one hand," he said. "You're on the list, I assume," she said. "I'm on the list," he said. "You're also on the list." It was not a declaration of love. It was better than a declaration of love, because it was a declaration of regard, of that particular and irreplaceable esteem that is harder to earn than love and more durable. She understood it as such, and she let it sit in her without answering it. Just rode beside him on the wide white road in the January cold with the mountains blue to the north, and the sky enormous and the world in every direction asking nothing of her but to be in it. February brought a spell of mild weather unusual for the Wyoming territory. 3 weeks of temperatures above freezing and sunlight that felt almost apologetic in its winter-spring ambivalence. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes, and the cattle, who had spent January huddled in the shelter pastures, spread out and grazed with something that looked almost like relief. On a Sunday in the middle of that mild spell, Frederick drove Matilda to her homestead as he sometimes did on her day off now, not because she needed the help but because he liked to come, and because the homestead was, in his understanding of her, a place he needed to know. They spent the morning working on a section of fence that the winter had pulled loose, working side by side in the mild sun, with the smell of mud and thaw and new grass just beginning under the last patches of snow. Afterward, they sat on the porch her father had built, with coffee from the small stove inside, and looked out at the 40 acres. The land was not much by objective measure. It would not support a serious cattle operation, but it had a quality of her in it now, a particular order and care, the marks of someone who had fought to keep it and had kept it. "He chose well," Frederick said, meaning her father. "He thought so," she said. "He used to say that any land you had to fight for was worth more than land that came easy." "Did he say what you were supposed to do with it once you'd fought for it?" "Build something on it," she said. "Something that lasts." Frederick was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. Then he said, without looking at her, "Matilda, I want to ask you something important." She waited. He turned to her. His face was as serious as she had ever seen it, and under the seriousness there was something open and certain, like the moment before sunrise when the sky declares itself. He said, "I want to marry you. I want you to be my wife, and I want to be your husband, and I want us to build our life together here in a way that belongs to both of us, not just to me." He paused. "I know you didn't come here looking for this. I know you are not a woman who needs someone else to make her life meaningful. But I hope you might want this anyway, the way I want it, because it would be a better life for both of us together than it would be separately." The field spread out before them in the thin February sun, and Matilda thought about her father, who had told her the world was large enough for a woman to be herself in it if she found the right part of it. She thought that she had found the right part of it. She thought she might also have found the right person. "Yes," she said, "I want that very much." He reached out and took her face in both hands, large, calloused, careful hands, and he kissed her there on the porch her father had built, in the February sunlight over the 40 acres her father had bought and she had fought to keep. And it was the kind of kiss that settles something, that makes the air afterwards feel different from the air before. They were married in the Callow Creek Church on the 15th of March, 1879, when the first real signs of spring were beginning in the territory, and the mud in the main street was ankle-deep and magnificent. The wedding was small, which suited both of them. Dovey stood with Matilda. Reuben stood with Frederick. The minister who served Callow Creek was a thin, cheerful man named Everett who had been marrying people in the territory for 11 years and had developed a certain warm efficiency about the process. Carrie, whose leg had healed over the winter and who had come back to the ranch in February, brought wildflowers that he had found along the creek bank, slightly muddy at the stems but genuinely cheerful. A handful of townspeople attended because there were never very many events in Callow Creek worth attending, and a wedding was always one of them. Mrs. Hendricks from the general store cried, which was her habit at weddings. The blacksmith, whose name was Darnell, sat in the back and nodded with great approval at the proceedings. When Everett said the words and they said the words back, and Frederick took Matilda's hand with the same certainty with which he had taken it that December night at the kitchen table, Matilda felt something complete itself inside her that she had not known was incomplete. After the ceremony there was a modest supper at the ranch house, and Dovey had made a cake with the white icing that was, she informed everyone, not to be commented upon in terms of the unevenness of the frosting, and it was the best cake Matilda had ever eaten. That evening, after the guests had gone, when the house was quiet, and the night was cold and clear and full of stars, Matilda stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked up at the Wyoming sky, which was doing what the Wyoming sky always did, reminding anyone who bothered to look that the world was very large and very old and very indifferent to human plans, and she thought that it was all right to be small under it, as long as you were small with someone who saw the same sky and was glad of it. Frederick came out and stood beside her and handed her a cup of coffee and stood in the cold with his shoulder against hers, and they looked at the stars together. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Are you asking because you don't know?" she said. "I know," he said. "I want to hear it." "I'm happy," she said. "More than that, I feel like myself all the way. That's the best version of happy." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the cold pressed in around them, and the stars were very bright, and the Collier ranch spread out around them in the darkness, 3,000 acres of their life together, with all its future still in front of them. The spring of 1879 was kinder than the spring of 1878. The calving losses were fewer, the weather held better, and the ranch came through the turn of the season with the herd in good condition and the finances in better order than the previous years. Frederick had hired a new hand in February, a quiet young man from Nebraska named Davis who was 22 and enormously capable on horseback, and who accepted Matilda's position on the ranch, with a matter-of-factness that Frederick privately attributed to the fact that Davis had been raised by a capable woman and knew better than to underestimate them. Reuben went into a quieter role as spring advanced, his age making the heavy work harder, and Frederick arranged it so that he handled the close work around the buildings and the equipment repair, which he was very good at, while Matilda and Carrie and Davis took the range work. Reuben seemed relieved by this, and his health was better for it. Matilda's homestead she kept, as she had told Frederick she intended to, because the land was her father's land and it was hers, and because Frederick had never suggested otherwise. They went there together some Sundays, the way they had during the courting. In July, they planted a kitchen garden on the east side of the cabin, which she had never had time to do alone, and the garden became a kind of project between them, tended on Sundays, more for the satisfaction of it than the necessity. It was in late summer of 1879 that Matilda realized she was expecting a child. She told Frederick on a Tuesday evening after supper, quietly and directly, as she told him most things. The expression that moved across his face was one she catalogued carefully, because she had never seen quite that combination before, a surprise layered over a joy so deep it seemed to require a moment to surface, like something rising from a great depth. He took both her hands in his and sat there holding them for a moment, and she let him, watching his face. "Are you well?" he said. "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said. "Tired some mornings, but well." "We'll get the doctor from Laramie City," he said. "Frederick," she said, with gentle patience. "Women have been having babies in this territory without doctors from Laramie City for quite some time." "We'll get the doctor from Laramie City," he said again, and the firmness of it was so clearly born from love and not from a lack of faith in her that she laughed and said all right, if it would settle his mind. The baby was a boy, born in April of 1880, in the beginning of the spring, as if he had chosen to arrive at the most inconvenient possible time for a cattle ranch, and had done so with great personal confidence. The doctor from Laramie City came as Frederick had promised, and Dovey was there, and Frederick paced outside the bedroom door in a way that Dovey later said was enough to wear a groove in the floorboards. The boy was healthy, with a substantial voice and dark eyes like his father, and a quality of paying attention to everything that Matilda recognized from her mirror. They named him Daniel, after Matilda's father. Frederick put the name forward first, which she had not expected, and when he said it she understood that he had known, without being told, what it would mean to her. Daniel Collier grew into a healthy, curious, perpetually muddy child who was writing before he could reliably read, though his mother remedied the reading part with the same methodical persistence she brought to everything. By the time he was 3, he had strong opinions about cattle that were, in the assessment of the hands, not entirely wrong. The Collier Ranch thrived through the early 1880s. The syndicate had eventually moved on to easier targets, discouraged by the combination of Frederick's legal groundwork and his neighbors' solidarity, because he had quietly organized several of the surrounding smaller ranchers into an informal cooperative that presented a more complicated legal face than any one ranch alone. This was not dramatic. There were no confrontations and no heroics, just the steady, practical work of building alliances and registering rights, and making it more trouble than it was worth to take something from people who intended to keep it. In 1882, they had a second child, a girl they named Margaret, after Frederick's mother, who had died the previous year in Texas without Frederick being able to reach her in time, which was a grief he carried quietly in the manner that was his way. Margaret was nothing like quiet. She arrived in the world making her opinions known and sustained the practice indefinitely, growing into a child who had her mother's directness and her father's stubbornness, in a combination that the hands agreed privately was going to be spectacular trouble, and that Matilda and Frederick privately thought was absolutely correct. The homestead 40 acres Matilda's father had bought became, in these years, a place they used together, a small summer retreat of sorts, the cabin maintained and the garden kept, the porch still standing where her father had built it. On the occasion of Daniel's 5th birthday, Frederick built a swing on the old cottonwood at the east corner of the cabin, and Daniel used it with the reckless enthusiasm of a boy who has not yet met a piece of equipment he believed could not be improved by being used at maximum force. Dovey remained at the ranch through all of this, a constant and indispensable presence, and when in 1883 she mentioned that she was thinking of buying a small piece of land she had identified near Callow Creek, Frederick helped her with the title registration without being asked, the same way she had helped Matilda navigate his stubbornness when Matilda needed it, which Matilda thought was a perfect symmetry. Dovey's land was 3 acres with a small frame house on it, and she went there on her own Sundays, the same arrangement Matilda had once had, and this felt to all of them like the right kind of ending to a story and the right kind of beginning to another. Reuben, whose health had continued to ease him toward gentler work, retired from the active ranch in 1883 as well, and Frederick built him a small addition on the back of the bunkhouse that was his own space with its own stove, and Reuben lived there, and helped with whatever he was able to help with and played with the children and was treated as what he was, which was family of the chosen kind, the kind that the West built more honestly than a lot of other places. Carey had gone on to his own life by then, having saved enough from his years at the Collier Ranch to buy into a small horse-breeding operation south of Cheyenne, and he came back once a year for a visit, and always brought something for the children, tools or books, or once, memorably, a very small pony that Daniel promptly named General and rode, with the solemnity of a commanding officer. The syndicate trouble surfaced again briefly in 1884, when a new agent appeared with new arguments about the water rights on the North Creek, which was the same argument they had tried in 1879 under different framing. Frederick had been expecting something like this, and the legal paperwork was already in order. He dealt with it through Aldrich in Laramie City, who by this point knew the Collier Ranch's legal situation as well as anyone alive, and the matter was resolved within 2 months without drama. Davis, the hand from Nebraska, became the foreman when Reuben stepped back, and he was good at it, methodical and fair and quietly authoritative in the way of people who are confident enough not to need to be loud about it. He hired 2 additional hands as the herd expanded, and by 1884 the Collier Ranch was running close to 1,100 head, which was larger than Frederick had originally planned, but which the land could support, and which the markets in Cheyenne were buying. On an evening in September of 1884, Frederick and Matilda sat on the ranch house porch together, a thing they did most evenings when the weather allowed, and the light was going gold over the distant mountains, and the children were inside with Dovey, Daniel complaining about his arithmetic and Margaret complaining about Daniel complaining. The cattle were in the home pasture, close enough to see. The air was cool and clear and smelled of sage and approaching autumn. "Do you remember," Matilda said, "the notice you tacked to the post outside the general store?" "I remember," he said. "I wrote mail on it." "You did," she said. "And you came anyway," he said. "You hired me anyway," she said. He looked at her across the space of the porch in the evening light, and she looked back at him with those clear creekwater eyes that had looked straight through him from the first moment in the corral and had been looking straight through him ever since, and he said, "It's the best decision I ever made." "Hiring me," she said. "That too," he said. "Everything that came from it." She reached over and took his hand, the way she had in the kitchen that December night, and they sat together on the porch of the life they had built, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening and the children inside and the particular quality of quiet that belongs to places where people have chosen to stay. Frederick said more softly, "Your father would be proud of you." "I know," she said. "I feel it." "Not because of all this," he said, meaning the ranch, the success, the visible things. "Because of how you are, because of who you are." She was quiet for a moment. "You know," she said, "when I came through that gate with the notice in my mind and your foreman's eyes on me and nothing but my own stubbornness to back it up, I was afraid. I didn't let it show, but I was afraid." "What were you afraid of?" he said. "That you would see exactly what you expected to see," she said, "instead of what was actually there." He squeezed her hand. "I almost did," he said. "I almost sent you away." "I know," she said, "but you didn't." "No," he said, "I didn't." The last of the evening light was warm on the mountains, and the sky was turning the soft colors it turned in September before the blue deepened to night. Inside, Margaret's voice had risen into an operatic declaration that whatever Daniel had done to her was unjust and unprecedented, and then there was a thump, and Dovey's voice, calm and absolute, saying some phrase in the tone that allowed no counterargument, and then silence. "We should go in," Matilda said. "In a minute," Frederick said. She did not argue with that. Another minute on the porch, in the September evening, watching the light change over the country that belonged to them and to which they belonged, was not a minute wasted. The years that followed were good years, built from the solid foundation of 2 people who had figured out, through work and difficulty, and the accumulated evidence of daily life, how to build something together that was bigger than either of them alone. There were bad seasons, because farming and ranching in the Wyoming territory always had bad seasons, and there were losses and difficulties, and the ordinary conflicts of any life shared between people with strong opinions. There were years when the cattle market dropped and years when the weather was cruel, and a year in 1886 when a late blizzard in April killed a significant number of the herd, and they had to make hard decisions about where to cut costs and where not to. They made those decisions together, at the kitchen table, with the account books open and the coffee going cold, and they disagreed sometimes and they argued sometimes, and they always came through to the other side of it, with the thing between them still solid and still chosen. Daniel, at 6, declared that he was going to raise horses, not cattle, a statement that Frederick received with equanimity and Matilda received with interest, and which proved over the years to be entirely accurate. He had a gift for horses that went beyond training into something like a conversation, and by the time he was 12, he was handling the ranch's remuda with a skill that the adults pretended not to find remarkable in a child. Margaret, at 4, decided that she was interested in everything and proceeded to be. She collected rocks and read Frederick's books and asked every visiting adult more questions than they were prepared to answer. She had, Matilda observed privately, the quality of a person who was going to require a very large world to be comfortable in, and she looked at her daughter with recognition, and something that was not quite pride because it was more personal than pride, a kind of gladness that went all the way down. Dovey's land near Callow Creek grew a garden that became something of a legend for its productivity. She came to the ranch 3 days a week through the late 1880s, but more as a beloved presence than as an employee. And when she came, she brought vegetables from her garden and opinions about the children's manners, and everything felt right and ordered in the way of things that have found their proper place. In the spring of 1887, Matilda planted a new garden at the ranch house, larger and more serious than the one they had kept at the homestead, with plans for vegetables and herbs, and along the south fence, a row of roses she had ordered from a nurseryman in Denver. Frederick said nothing about the roses, which were not practical and were not cheap and were not anything he would have thought to do himself, but when they came in the summer, bright and improbable against the rough wood of the Wyoming fence, he stood looking at them for a long moment with an expression she recognized. "They were your mother's favorite," she said. He looked at her. "How did you know that?" "You mentioned it once," she said. "About a year ago. You might not remember." He was quiet. He looked at the roses again. He said, "Thank you, Matilda. They're for all of us," she said, "but also for her." It was the kind of thing that built a marriage, these ordinary, extraordinary moments, the accumulation of being known and being seen, and being considered by another person not because they were obliged to, but because they could not help it, because attention had become love, had become habit, had become the structure of life itself. In the summer of 1888, on a Sunday afternoon when the ranch was at its most peaceful, and the children were somewhere they had promised was not dangerous, and the sky was the particular blue that Wyoming did better than anywhere Matilda had ever been, she sat on the ranch house porch with her husband and her coffee and the quiet between them that was better than most people's conversation. "What are you thinking about?" Frederick said. "That notice on the post outside the general store," she said. "I think about it sometimes. Wanted male strong back," he said. "You could have meant any of 1,000 men," she said. "I could have read it and turned around and gone home and tried something else." "But you didn't," he said. "But I didn't," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what I thought that first morning when you came through the gate? That you'd made a mistake," she said, "tacking the notice." "No," he said. "I thought this is going to complicate everything, and I hired you anyway because I looked at you and I saw someone who was entirely who they said they were, and that is so rare in this world that when you encounter it you cannot turn it away." She looked at him sideways. "You thought all that in a corral." "I thought it over the following weeks," he said. "But I knew it in the corral." She shook her head, but she was smiling, and the smile was the one she had that was entirely private, the one that was only his, and he knew it and was glad of it. The sun went slowly across the Wyoming sky, and the shadows of the mountains reached long fingers across the plain, and the roses along the south fence were in their second summer of bloom, and the voices of the children came from somewhere around the barn in a quality of noise that suggested they were fine and probably also getting into something. The cattle were in the north pasture, visible from the porch as a dark mass against the evening grass. The Collier ranch spread around them in every direction, alive and working in theirs. Daniel appeared around the corner of the barn holding what appeared to be a very small and extremely offended garter snake, delivering a lecture to his sister about its proper habitat. Margaret was listening with the focused interest she brought to everything, despite having been the one who had clearly disturbed the snake in the first place. "Daniel," Frederick called across the yard. "The snake is fine, Papa," Daniel called back, with the particular confidence of a 10-year-old who has decided he is the authority on the subject. "Let it go anyway," Frederick said. A pause. The snake was considered. It was released. It departed at speed. Daniel and Margaret watched it go and then turned and came toward the porch in the evening light, dusty and alive with the peculiar energy that children have when the day has been good. They came up the porch steps and Margaret leaned against Matilda's knee with the unconscious ease of absolute security, and Daniel sat on the step and pulled a piece of grass from the edge of the porch and chewed on it philosophically. "Mama," Margaret said. Matilda said. "When you were young, did you want to be a rancher?" Matilda considered this. "When I was young," she said, "I wanted to do something real. I didn't know exactly what form it would take." "And this is it," Margaret said. "This is it," Matilda said. "This and everything it brought with it." Margaret seemed satisfied by this answer and turned to look at the evening view from the porch with the expression of a child who is filing information away for later. Frederick caught Matilda's eye and she caught his, and between them passed something that needed no words, that had been built over 10 years of working side by side and sleeping under the same roof, and eating at the same table and raising children in the enormous honest country. They had both chosen before they chose each other, which maybe made the choosing of each other inevitable. The stars came out slowly as the dark deepened, and the mountains went from blue to gray to invisible, and the ranch settled into the particular quiet of a Wyoming night, and the four of them stayed on the porch a little longer than necessary, which was exactly long enough, because some evenings you know, even while you are in them, that they are the kind that make up the substance of a life, and you want to be present for every moment of them. Matilda Bancroft had come through a gate with a notice in her mind and her gloves in her pocket, and nothing to recommend her but exactly who she was, and she had never for a single day since been anything less than that. And Frederick Collier, who had almost sent her away, who had been a man of custom and assumption, and a notice on a post outside a general store that said mail, had looked at her and hired her and loved her and built the best life he could imagine alongside her, and never for a single day since had looked back. The Wyoming sky spread its enormous dark above them, and it was full of light, and the world it looked down on was full of everything that mattered, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.